We can now start our next session, and I'm happy to invite our next speaker from the University of Exeter in the UK. Hello, Professor Anna Mountford-Zimdars. Professor Anna is a professor of social mobility and academic director of the Center of Social Mobility at the University of Exeter. Anna has a particular interest in issues around university access and admissions and policy solutions to mitigate inequality in education access, progress, and success. She will present her talk that will provide data from a recent study performed with teachers, parents, admission staff, and students. Her talk is entitled Safety, Well-Being, Progression, Attainment, and Some Silver Linings for Equity. Findings from 2,200 responses to Exeter's Rapid Response COVID-19 Education Research. The stage is yours, and I will be giving you a note in 5 minutes before the end.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, I hope so. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I've had the opportunity to listen to the earlier sessions, and I've greatly enjoyed them, found them really interesting and very inspiring. I should maybe start off by saying that I'm not a teacher. Both of my parents are teachers, and I have really tried very hard to stay away from teaching. I studied politics and sociology at university, but somehow I ended up in a teacher department at a university. Maybe it's destiny, I don't know. You have invited me because I'm one of the many academic scholars doing research on the impact of the COVID-19 school closure. So today I'm largely talking about some survey research we did. It had 2,219 responses, and the responses were from parents, from teachers, and from students themselves, but because of our ethics agreement, they were all aged 16 to 8 and older. And because my work generally focuses specifically on access to higher education, I also included a survey of higher education outreach professionals. So in the UK, these are people who work with young people to support them in going to university. There are two other parts of research bits that I'm currently working on, but we're still sort of very much in the process of analyzing it. So even this was a very strange coincidence, because even before the lockdown and before schools were closed, I had started working with colleagues on a project on what is it like to home educate your children. So in the UK, you are allowed to home educate your children, to choose to do so. And it is a very under-researched part of the population. So we had started this work in January, and then suddenly the school closure happened and everybody was schooling from home. So those who normally home educate are very quick to point out that this is not home education. This, in many instances, is remote schooling. It's not a sort of fundamental shift to how you think about education. So this is quite a big part of our work now as well. So we've got 380 surveys and 50 interviews, and we've also done some work specifically with parents with children with special educational needs, and I've got a bit of research on that. So what I was sort of planning on doing is that I will actually not talk for too long maybe about some of the specific findings, because I think a lot of what I'm going to say has already been said in so many words by other speakers. So I want to leave a little bit more time for discussion. I also wanted to say though, so this is just in terms of my work context, I work at the Center for Social Mobility, and in the UK we are quite unique. We are the first centre, and I think still currently the only one that's set up with two directors. We're one director, myself, I'm an academic with a traditional academic profile like a PhD, and now I'm a professor. My co-director comes from practice, so she is very much running all the programs that we have as a university to support social mobility, to work with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, to support them in access to and progression within university. I also, and that disappeared, I had on the slide a little note saying that I'm just absolutely thrilled to have this opportunity to be part of your event today, because I was very fortunate to become mother to twins 3.5 years ago. And since then, I have clearly not traveled at all. So personally, I should say I'm having quite a good experience of the lockdown so far, that I'm professionally part of networks that have, like, half a year ago seemed completely inaccessible. That why would I be able to come to Israel to talk to you when I've got toddler twins? So yeah. So as a researcher, the sort of first approach to the research is really, what is the experience? There are lots of thoughts of what the experience would be, lots of educated predictions. What are the implications for access and transition, especially into higher education? Are there interventions that we could put in place? What policy might help? And the assumption, and I think that's been echoed by everybody today, is that the school closure will be worse for disadvantaged students, that there are differentials in access to technology and internet, differentials in home support, but also in school support. So with the school support, I should say one of the big dividers in England is that about 10% of children go to private schools. And from the beginning of the lockdown, there was people were saying that the private schools are much better set up in dealing with the remote education compared with the state schools. In our survey, indeed, teachers said that they thought that the school closure would have a negative impact on pupil well-being and safety. And I think that is everything else we've heard today. We had a lot of sort of qualitative questions where people could elaborate on what they were seeing and what they expected. So I think, I mean, there's one quote here where a teacher said, "I've taught children who are part of vulnerable families that are not safe at home. For these children, it's normally hard enough letting them go home for the weekend, knowing they won't be coming back to the safety of school for 2 days, but now that could be weeks of being in an unsafe environment." So there are very big concerns here. And I wanted to share another bit here, which is because we talk a lot about supporting more access to technology. So I was talking with one teacher who their school had really gone above and beyond to provide laptops for all their students, and especially the vulnerable students who didn't have access to technology at home. So in this case, they had provided this student with a laptop, but the parents had sold it within 24 hours to fund their drug use. And because the teachers were concerned about the student, they provided the student with a mobile phone. This might have actually been from the teacher's personal money, I don't know that. But the phone was also sold within 24 hours. So I think that highlight that certainly in Britain, I mean, one of the first policy responses has been that this is an economic issue, and it's sort of about economic inequality in access to, certainly in access to technology, but also in access to hardware. But it probably won't surprise you, but it was a surprise to some people here that this is not just a technology issue. Another teacher said this, and maybe you can relate to this, that it's very difficult or impossible to provide the level of differentiation that you would provide in a face-to-face classroom to replicate that online, although our previous speaker has clearly succeeded in that, so it's not all necessarily doom and gloom here. Then there's something about access to a private place to study. So in our survey, most students did actually have access to a private place to study at home, but those students who are more disadvantaged, which we measured by being eligible for free school meals, they had less access to a private place to study. Also, most students had access to a laptop at home, but many didn't have access all the time, and they said that they would be able to participate better in education if they had their own laptops. But I think the main finding was really around mental health and well-being. So we used a validated psychological scale, and the levels of well-being for all respondents, for the teachers, for the parents, and for the students, were all significantly below what we know to be population averages in a sort of normal time. In terms of the students, they were particularly low for male students. They were also lower for those without a quiet place to study. And I thought this was perhaps interesting. They were also lower for those who didn't have plans for the future. And specifically who didn't have plans to go to university in the future. So I want to explore that in a little bit more detail in the future. With the parents, we found that many of them, they were struggling. It was like it's complicated. If parents were struggling to combine looking after children and doing their own work. So I have a quote here from a parent who said, "I'm so tired at the end of each day that I've cried a few times. But on the plus side, it is nice, it's good to spend more time with the children." And I think that's what's coming out again and again from all this piece of research we've been doing, other research. It's not a singular experience, this school lockdown. I mean, some people are having a positive experience and some are very negative, and some aspects might be positive and some aspects negative. I should also say that we've tried to do research in particular with single parents, because we think they are a group who is particularly suffering at the moment. And it's been quite difficult to get hold of research respondents, which I think just highlights how overstretched single parents are if they're trying to work and look after children at the current moment in time. So in the UK, schools are slowly reopening, but single parents have never been classified as a vulnerable group. This contrasts with, I'm originally from Germany, so in Germany, the government relatively quickly classified single parent family as key workers, which meant that parents were eligible to send their children to school. So different governmental responses to that issue. So more findings from the parent survey that affluent parents, they are more confident about schooling from home. The schools where the children of affluent parents go, they provide more contact. Perhaps unsurprisingly, children in private schools have access to more devices at home than other children. And private schools, they're more likely to teach remotely, so to provide an entire day of structured lessons. So parents we've talked to, they say, well, from where their children are in private school, they say, well, from 9 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my child is being taught remotely in different lessons. This is very different from the experience of many other children who might get a few lesson plans and the parents are asked to supervise them in a study. Many parents, they do enjoy having more time with their children, but they do struggle with the competing demands if they are asked to work at the same time. Now, perhaps, I think none of this was maybe so surprising so far, so a few things that maybe have some surprises, or this is a word cloud of the experience of students during the lockdown. And when we were first doing it, I said, oh, can't we do color code this as positives and negatives? And then we found that it's really difficult to do that because many things are not necessarily either positive or negative alone. They are complex. So it's from that word cloud alone, I think it sort of highlights that there isn't a singular experience. Now this is again something that I think I find interesting and wonder whether I can explore it further in the future. So there's a surprise here that there is some indication in our survey that students who are better off, they miss the teachers more than students who are less advantaged, who miss the physicality of the school. So there are two quotes here. One student who said that they miss the teacher and other students in school, which help them motivate and help you learn. And there's a student who is eligible for free school meals who comes from a less advantaged family, and she just comments on how it's very difficult to work in the same place at home all the time. It's emotionally and physically exhausting. So I wondered, and maybe this isn't new to you, but I found that interesting, that difference, and I want to explore that further. Then there is that finding that students who have plans to go into higher education after school, that they have better mental health during the lockdown. So maybe it's just about generally having plans for the future, that is good for your well-being, but maybe there's something about education planning here as well. And here, this is hopefully positive. We asked teachers, how do you anticipate the experience of offsite teaching and new knowledge and skills developed as a consequence of the school lockdown? will impact on your teaching when schools reopen? And the answer is here that 55% think it will have a positive impact, and 39% think neither positive nor negative. So I think that's a positive story that which maybe it's a lot less radical than the previous speakers sort of passing comments to us that their education will never be the same. So it's sort of indicating like there's a massive change going on, and we don't quite know what the future will look like. But and our survey went out really early. We went out 3 days into the school closure. We started our survey. So this is very early on that teachers were already saying, well, we think it could have positive impact. I should say we're trying to do a second wave of our survey at the moment, but still trying to fundraise a little bit to do that. So hopefully we will do a second wave, and then we would love to ask this question again and see how this has changed now since March 2020. And I told you earlier that I had an interest in the idea of home education as opposed to sending children to school before the school closure. So we included a question in our survey about whether parents would continue to home educate their children. And we said that we asked the question that if they would want to do it if the government were to pay them as they do currently, like when people are not working. So if the government provided some sort of payment for parents to stay at home and educate children themselves. So 21% of respondents said they would homeschool their child for part of the week. So when we look a little bit more at the sort of parents who might wish to continue home education, there was a subgroup of parents with children with special educational needs, and that came out of our special educational needs research as well, that some parents said, especially, I remember some quotes from parents who have children who are autistic, who say that the school closure is really very good for their children. It's helping them, reducing the complexities of lives and even of special schools. So there I wonder whether there's something we can learn from these parents about what it is they're doing at the moment that they feel works better for their children than schooling, that they want to continue after when they have the choice again to send their children to school. So what is it maybe, I don't know whether this is a radical thing to say in this sort of context where most of you are practicing teachers, I presume, like can teachers learn something from parents who have been experimenting with homeschooling for the first time? And also flipping that sort of observation that some children are clearly happier and safer in schools. There are also some children who are happier and safer at home. So again, this highlights that there isn't a singular experience of the school closure. Also, in terms of my core research area, which is around access to higher education, there are massive opportunities for greater access for groups who struggle with traditional setups. So I work at the University of Exeter, which is in a relatively rural part of the UK. We also have a campus in Cornwall, which is even more rural. And a lot of our students the local students, they can have very long distances to travel to come to university, and the public transport network isn't fabulous. And if they have caring and other responsibilities, our traditional university setup of teaching sort of between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. And requiring students to be physically present isn't very supportive for these groups, but also in terms of making choices. At the moment, it's possible for young people to have a taster course of a university in the north of England in the morning, sort of find out how they will teach mathematics, and then join a Zoom webinar at a university that's an hour and a day's travel away for finding out about their offering. So in some ways, it could be a massive opening up of opportunities and some equalizing, although I think the need for translating online information into for young people to access that information, there's still a big task there that teachers and other qualified people need to do. So I think just putting information out there is clearly not equalizing access. It still needs that translation and support job, but there is that opportunity. So summary then for me is that there's a diversity of experience of school closure, that among our respondents, well-being was of higher concern than attainment, and that there is an opportunity for lasting changes that could enhance equity. There is, and you will get the slides, I've put in the references just to the research I've been referring to today. I mean, there's quite a lot of academic research now, so this is just referring to our project here. And I'd love to have some time for discussion and questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. And now we indeed will take some questions that will be presented by Jay.
Okay, I'm looking forward to more questions being asked here, although we've had some references to UDL, to Universal Design for Learning, and perhaps you'd like to relate to how these principles are expressed or come to expression in your research.
I am familiar with this approach, and I think it's not something I can answer directly, because I should say we did actually have questions on this in the survey, but we haven't analyzed it yet. There's a whole battery of questions about how teaching is delivered that I haven't commented upon because it's not my specialism. Mm-hmm. I think generally the initial reaction from the English sector was just put teaching online as quickly as possible and worry about the design aspects later. And I think certainly at the university where I work, we are seeing that initially it was just like, you need to move all your teaching online within days, and we don't care whether you know how to do it or whether you've ever done anything like this before. But now that we are sort of in a more mature phase of this move to online education, there is much more talk about, well, how do we make it inclusive? How do we and how do we maximize the face time? How do we flip classrooms? So there's much more good practice emerging, and much more thinking about what needs to be synchronous and what is asynchronous.
One of the questions that comes up here is that because we're in a situation where we're basically faced with emergency remote instruction, whether in a situation such as that, what we're learning about teaching is really something we can learn about, because obviously these weren't the best circumstances for being able to make the move, for making the changes that someone would like to do if they had the time and the energy and the resources to do it. This was tomorrow you have to. And so that becomes a big question. And I think that part of that same question is the question of, you noted, for instance, that there are children who come to school and are able to get a hot meal. And I think that perhaps there's greater respect for what schools are able to do beyond the teaching, beyond the classroom aspects, that wasn't necessarily something that was recognized before then. In terms of the questions, one of the questions get raised, I think that should be the question about, do you have details about kindergarten teachers and parents?
No, that's a very good question. They weren't really in our target group, although because I have got kindergarten age children in kindergarten, it's a group that I'm really interested in. And it is something, and maybe if whoever has asked this question would like to get in touch afterwards, I mean, I would be very interested in exploring that further. It just needs a bit of thinking of what sort of the hook is, because I think our research, the reason we focused on schools initially is because it's about, I think the initial drivers for the research was about inequities in attainment and progression. And so for kindergarten, which is not mandatory in the UK, it's obviously, it's a different set of issues you would be researching from attainment as such.
Another question, similar question that came, what had to do with children with special needs. And for instance, one of the comments by Alona Farkush was that sometimes distance learning can be very good for particular special needs. Do you have something to report about that?
So I think what I've got so far is too blunt, maybe. I mean, I also see there was a question about the special needs survey in general, so I can just say we opened it to all parents with, like, we snowballed it through networks, through special educational needs sort of hubs, charities. So it was parents with any child with special educational needs of school age, and some had several children, and they told us what the type of special educational need was. And I think it's too early to really like, we've only really analyzed 2 of the 70 questions we've asked so far. We've only analyzed the question on what changes to your teaching have you made since the lockdown started. And what we found is that parents have said that they are no longer trying to be sort of super parent. They're no longer trying to do it all. They're more focused on their child and their needs. They're having more breaks, shorter sessions, and they're trying to make it more fun, more child-centered and fun. And that's what we've learned from that survey so far. And that is a survey where out of the 280 responses, we had about 20 said they would want to continue home educating their children when the schools reopen, because they saw that a change in their child's happiness and well-being.
By the way, I see in the chat now that people have reacted that in Philadelphia, for instance, hot meals were actually, people came to take them from the school, and in New York, that's still happening even in certain circumstances. One last question here. It's a hard one, so you don't have to get too much into it. But in general, what you expect that educators and policymakers will do with the insights you've gained from your research? Now that's, in 30 seconds, can you answer that to us?
I just hope they will focus more on not just on the physical aspects of education and the transactional aspects of learning gains and attainment and progression and providing laptops, but more on the sort of holistically that these are children, they need more than access to knowledge and passing exams. But if we are planning for, if this should happen again, if we have a second wave, I think we need to have a better support structure in place for the most vulnerable children, and for their safety and well-being. And I don't totally know what this looks like, because I certainly don't want to advocate taking all vulnerable children out of their families and putting them into big orphanages. But I think there are too many children who have been left without contact to any adult who is not in their family for too long, and who've not had hot meals for too long. So I think that would be my policy hope.